So we find ourselves on page 61, and we're looking at the Ten Commandments. And we come to verse 13 in the sixth commandment, you shall not murder. And you can see that there's a number in a row that are short and sharp, and they follow one another. As we begin to think about these next few commandments, it will be worth to bear in mind what Paul says over in Romans chapter 13. He says, the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be are summed up in this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. So behind these short and quick commands is still this picture of God's people and God's community knowing how to love not only God, but to love their neighbor, and the beauty that brings to God's people. So as we go and we start through and we look at this short commandment today, please don't lose sight of that. But we find ourselves in verse 13, and we see there the command, you shall not murder. Now, when it comes to thinking about death and killing in the Old Testament, there are 7 different Hebrew words that cover the idea and description of killing and death in the Old Testament. And none of them ever refer to the killing of an animal. Let me rephrase that. There are 47, if you look at this verse here, 13, and you say, you shall not murder, that word there is the Hebrew word, rotzah. Okay, the Hebrew word rotzah. And that is used 47 times in the Old Testament. Okay, so there's 7 that are used about killing and death altogether. This one here in the Ten Commandments is used 47 times only in the Old Testament, and that word is never used about the killing of animals, okay? So when we think about something like veganism and that they would like to apply murder to animals, the Bible would work in a different direction. It is never applied to the killing of animals. The word rotzah here in verse 13 is never used about killing in war in the Old Testament. We haven't got time to look into that, but that's the reality in the Old Testament. It is never used either about capital punishment, that right of the government to take life for life through the courts in a legal manner. So the word here in chapter 13 for murder covers 2 types of killing. It covers premeditated killing, murder, as we would say today, as we would understand murder. It covers that. And it also covers accidental killing, what we would call manslaughter today. Now, I know those definitions are being changed all the time, but in general terms, the way we understand murder and the way we understand manslaughter today are covered by this word here, rotzah in the Hebrew, and murder in our passage here. And when we read Numbers 35 together, that word was applied to both those types of killing in that passage. So to the one killing that was clearly murder and intentional, that word was applied. And to the killing that was accidental, it was also used. And the command here in verse 13 says that you shall not do either of those. That's what it is saying. Neither is to be done. So why are we to take human life or not to take human life, whether on purpose or by accident? Why are we not to do that? And the answer, as you can see from the heading that we've got on the slide there, is because human life is holy. When we say the word holy, we don't mean sinless or perfect. We mean human life is set apart by God. It is totally different from all other forms of life on this planet. It is completely different to animal life, and it is completely different to plant life. In that regard, it is set apart and it is holy. So why is human life unique and valuable then? Well, the answer is that we are made, or one of the answers is that we are made in the image of God. We're made by God and we're made in his likeness. And we find this in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. You might remember this is the occasion where God speaks to Noah. God has created the world. He's created Adam and Eve originally. Wickedness has come in. God has judged the world through a flood. And now we have a new beginning, a recreation. And at this point, God speaks law to Noah. And he says, whoever sheds the blood of man or woman, mankind, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. So you see the value there, don't you, in human life that God puts upon it. Life for life. That's the value that God places on it. And he gives the reason for it. For God made man in his own image, in his own likeness. That's the reason for the value. Here's a description to a certain degree of our image and value that we have. This is by a Christian man called Francis Schaeffer. And he says, the very humanness of man or woman bears witness to our distinction from the rest of God's created order. Our creativity, our sense of justice and morality, our self-awareness, our ability to communicate and use the power of language, our minds and our never-dying soul are all evidences that we are made in the image of God. We are set apart. We are different. We are valuable in a way that no other creature is. That is why when we drive down the road in our car and a moth hits our window screen, we normally squirt the water and work the window wipers without too much thought. If we hit a dog, we stop the car and we get out and we're concerned. There's a concern about that animal. If we hit a human and they bang against our window screen and fly over our car, we feel like retching. We are in turmoil immediately because within us, God has given us a sense that humans are made in the image of God. And we know that value instinctively. That human value does not change with circumstances, ever. So poverty doesn't change human value. Weakness doesn't change this human value. Physical and mental limitations don't change this human value. A criminal record doesn't change this human value. Listen to how it's put in Proverbs 14. God says, whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt or disregard for their maker. That's the maker of the poor. So you see, the person's value doesn't change with their poverty. God remains their maker. They still keep their value. And our value doesn't decrease with our crime or our limitations or our disadvantages. This year, we are remembering quite a sober event in human history, which is the liberation of concentration camps drawing towards the end of the Second World War. One of those concentration camps was Bergen-Belsen, which was liberated on the 15th of April, 1945. This is 75 years. But the men that went into that camp to liberate it were broken down by what they saw, because it was a horrific sight of masses of starving and dead bodies of humanity just covering the ground wherever you looked. Each one of those twisted, stinking, starving, skeletal people was a life full of worth and value. And to lose sight of this is to move towards murder. There's a greater shock on that scene. Each of the Belsen guards that were there that day, heartless, twisted, darkened with hate and evil, carried the same value as their victims. And to lose sight of that is to move you towards murder as well. So Hillfields Church, Coventry, in your daily life and thoughts and attitudes, never move away from seeing all people as made in God's image and carrying that unique value that He gives them. Because if you do move away from that, you move towards murder, either with your hands or with your heart. So there are three areas where the value of human life should be upheld. Well, we're just going to think about three. There are plenty more. And the first one that we're going to think about is in society. Society is to uphold the value of human life. And there are many ways within society that we could think about the value of human life being upheld. We just want to focus on one way, and that way is capital punishment. Now, that phrase might stir up in people all sorts of different opinions, and I accept that and respect that. Let's give a little bit of time just to thinking it through. When I speak about capital punishment, I mean a very tight definition by that capital punishment. I mean where the government has the power to take the life of a murderer. A murderer being the definition of one who is intentionally killed with premeditation. That's the definition of capital punishment that we're thinking of. Now, some might feel that Jesus has ruled this out by what he says maybe in Matthew chapter 5. He says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek." But here, Jesus is simply ruling out us as individuals taking the law into our own hands, becoming revengeful. That's what he's ruling out. He's not ruling us out seeking justice through the law. And in fact, if a government was to actually operate on this principle, it would fall apart in its justice. Now, we've already seen in the Old Testament that it demanded death for murder. And the New Testament never disagrees with that. Listen to how Paul puts it in Romans chapter 13. He says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason," or they don't carry the sword. And of course, the picture of a sword there is one of bringing death by judgment. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Governments are to carry a sword. And Paul, who wrote this, he understood that in other contexts. You might remember he stood before the Roman governor Festus in Acts chapter 25, and he said to him, "If I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die." Paul didn't object to the system. Jesus understood the government was given this type of authority when he stood before Pontius Pilate before he was killed. Pilate said to him, "Don't you realize I have power to either free you or to crucify you? I have the power of capital punishment." Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given you from above." That authority was a delegated authority from God. The fact that governments may carry the sword in a corrupt way, or that they might make mistakes in carrying the sword, doesn't take away the fact that God has given his authority to governments to hold murderers accountable. And so, as we said, in Numbers we read this: do not accept a ransom for the life of a murderer who deserves to die, one who has premeditatively killed, planned their actions. They are to be put to death. No ransom, no payment, no sidestep is to be made between the offense and the verdict and the carrying out of the judgment. There is to be an accounting for that life. That's what God said to Noah in Genesis 9, verse 5. He said, if blood is shed, I will demand an accounting of you. And that word demand, God is saying, I will pursue it relentlessly. It's important to me. So when governments and societies begin to accept ransoms, lesser things, rather than death for murderers, we devalue humanity and we deny the accounting that God requires. Now, one of the reasons I think that we struggle with the idea of capital punishment is because we are focusing on the wrong thing. We often focus on the person rather than on God. We start looking at capital punishment and we see it in terms of a deterrent for other people. Or we look at the person and we think that a better option would be rehabilitation. Or we are worried about the fact that a miscarriage of justice could be carried out. And those are legitimate considerations, but they are not the primary issue with capital punishment. Capital punishment is God-focused, not man-focused. It recognizes God's ownership of us all and God's workmanship in us all. The command not to murder isn't primarily about keeping law and order. It is about honoring the image of God in mankind. That's what it's primarily about. We're to feel the weight of human life, its value, and its connection to God as our creator and the giver of his image. So if you had been tasked with clearing out the old family shed at the bottom of the garden, and you open the doors and it just seems to be full of rubbish, you can't really see anything in there of value, and your decision is just to get a big skip and throw everything in there, and then one of your relatives comes and says, oh, that thing there, that's grandma's. She knows it's right there in that spot. She made it. It's precious to her. Now, I'm anticipating that that's going to change what you do with it. That it doesn't end up in the skip. Because it suddenly has the value of the owner upon it. Well, that's what we're talking about with human life, and that's what capital punishment recognizes. Such knowledge transforms what we do. When we recognize who owns and made the murdered person, it transforms how we respond to their killing. God demands an accounting. Now, I'm not trying to make here a political point at all. I am aiming to make a spiritual statement that human life is holy and of immense value. And this dignity and value is only truly demonstrated in a society when a government upholds the law and demands life for life. That's what I believe the Bible is teaching. And to move away from that is to lose sight of how valuable and how precious and how set apart God has made each one of us. That's the first area of human life, first area where the value of human life should be upheld in society. The second is in the womb of the pregnant mother. Fertilization is when life begins. That's why the angel said to Mary when he announced that Jesus was going to be born, he said, "You will conceive and give birth." The good news of Jesus, that life was coming, began with where life begins in the womb. Gestation, the 9-month development of the baby in the womb, is a work of God, not the mother. That's what we find in Psalm 139. He says there, "You knit me together," just like with knitting needles, "you knit me together in my mother's womb." God is the one doing the creating. The baby is his workmanship. Lack of form, lack of mental or physical ability do not diminish the baby's worth one bit. God is making that baby to bear his image. Also, he is making that baby to fulfill his purpose. God has purposes for that life. When we abort the zygote or the fetus or the child in the womb, we deny God's work. We dethrone him, and we deny the worth and purpose he has given to the child. We tear up his story and we throw it in the bin. So if you imagine a class of children and each little child, young child, is writing their story, and they get so far, and then the teacher comes along and he picks up one of the children's stories and he scrunches it up and he throws it in the bin, the class would be shocked. How much more should we be shocked when that happens with human life? No matter where you stand on when a fertilized egg becomes a person with a soul, the fact is that any intervention in the womb at any time is interrupting God's workmanship. It's taking his work, his story, and throwing it in the bin, literally. Many of you will know the picture of this girl, Chechwava Kwotka. In this picture, she is 14 years old. That's her photo in the German concentration camp, Auschwitz. Not many days after this, she is murdered. But you can look at her, and you can see that she should have had years ahead of her. But she never lived them. They were stolen from her. Someone intervened in her life and they had no right to do it. And she never lived her life. Taken. What right did they have? For the baby in the womb, those stolen years are no less real. And she was not lacking any less purpose. Here's another picture. This is a picture of life in the southern states of America in the 1800s. And you can see the scene, can't you? And the kind of words and phrases that are said in this room are "my property," "no rights," "not human," as they looked them in the face. These are the words of slave owners. But shockingly, they are the words of pregnant mothers too. My property, no rights, not human. And they are the words of medical experts up and down our country. But they are not the words of God. You know, if you're like me, maybe you have daydreamed at times and you said, if I were in Germany back in 1942, I would have spoken up. Or if I found myself in the southern states of America in the 1800s, I would have spoken up. Well, we are in the United Kingdom in 2020. And each year, right now, 200,000 abortions take place and more. How are we speaking? It's no good looking at the injustice of other times and dreaming what we would be and do. Now, we know the church is not to be political. We are not to be political. The gospel is at the center of our message, and it must never, ever be dethroned from there. We are not a political entity, but we are moral. And we are to possess and have a moral outrage at appropriate times. Not to be outraged is not to capture the heart of God at times. Just like an interpreter or a translator, if you are having a translator translate for you and you are a passionate speaker, you want them to translate passionately, don't you? If they simply give monotone over your presentation, they don't do you justice. If you are full of passion and they just deliver in a monotone, you're not representing them correctly. We need to know God's heart on these issues, and we need to be willing to capture his voice in the right way at the right time. I don't believe the world is hearing the moral outrage that they should when it comes to this issue. My dear friends and dear people here this morning, abortion is murder. It is premeditated murder. You interrupt God's workmanship. You tear up his story. You deny the value and dignity he has given life in the womb. You deface and destroy the image of God within you. And God is angry, and we are guilty. The third area where the value of human life should be upheld is in the church. Do you value your brother and sister this morning? Do you value them? When you look at them, do you see God's ownership on them? Do you see his workmanship in them? Do you see his purposes being worked out in their life? Do you esteem and respect them highly? Do you? Because there is murder in the church. Not with the hand, but with the heart. Listen to how James puts it. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. Listen to what Jesus says in a similar theme. You have heard that our ancestors were told, you must not murder. If you commit murder, you are subject to judgment. But I say, if you are even angry with someone, you are subject to judgment. If you call someone an idiot, you are in danger of being brought before the court. And if you curse someone, you are in danger of the fires of hell. Jesus says clearly that murder happens in the heart. It's the heart that moves the hand and moves the lips. How many bodies are at the bottom of my heart and your heart this morning? How many disfigured image bearers lie murdered by your thoughts and words? You might have heard in the news this morning or even last night about Carolyn Flack, a TV presenter who took her own life. And I don't know all the ins and outs. I don't know a lot about her. I've just read a few things. But one thing that seems to materialize is that in her present situation and all that's going on, she was murdered by the media or by social media many times over. Social media is a place of murder all the time. People take advantage to vent their hate and say what they will and destroy characters. From their heart, hate pours out. And it's no surprise that a person in a celebrity status with all sorts of things going on, with a court case coming up, out come people and they give their opinion and they pour out their hate. And she's been murdered even before she murders herself, which of course suicide tragically is. None of us has the right over our own bodies to do with them as we wish. So the Bible warns us that there is nothing hidden that will not be exposed for each one of us. Listen to what 1 John chapter 3 says. Anyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life residing in him or her. What stark words for you and me this morning. If there is murder in the church, let us turn from hatred and anger in our hearts. Let us turn from gossip and words that deface and destroy others. Let's repent. Finally, is there hope for you and me? For murderers like you and me, is there hope this morning? Maybe you are sitting here and you have or are hating in your heart. You have hidden murders. Maybe you are sitting here and you have had an abortion. Another hidden murder. But the truth is this morning is that we are all murderers. That's what we've been seeing. In our hearts, we are all murderers together. We are guilty before God. And there is hope for people like you and me. And we saw it there in Numbers 35. Maybe I can just try and retell that story slightly. But if you will imagine back then in Israel, a man and his friend going out and they are collecting firewood and they're chopping wood together, and he pulls back the axe and the metal head flies off and it hits his friend in the head and it kills him. And he looks at the situation and he knows that the law demands his death for that. And he knows that the family will come seeking it. He has only one hope, and that is to run to the city of refuge, which is what he does. And he gets there and he pleads his case. And the congregation, that group of people set aside to judge such people, bring him out into the community and they set him down and they hear the case. And they say that it was manslaughter. It was accidental. And so he can be returned to that place of safety. But did you know, in a way, it's a prison of hopelessness. He can never leave it. He can never do enough time there to ever get out. You know, before God, except by the precious death of his only son, who is a high priest, the high priest, sent by God to be put on a cross, that forgiveness might come to those who put their trust in him. Do you know, in that passage in Numbers 35, there is a redeemer mentioned. You know, Jesus is The Redeemer. You might have heard that word. Jesus the Redeemer, the one who buys back his lost family, the kinsman redeemer, the closest relative. That's what Redeemer is. The one who pays the cost to bring his family back to himself. And there's a Redeemer in Numbers 35. It might surprise you who it is, though, because it's the one who has the right of vengeance over the one who is killed. It's the avenger of blood. That is the word in the Hebrew there for the closest relative, the Redeemer. He has the rights. And God has the rights over you. Jesus Christ has the rights over your life. Isn't it incredible then that the one who has the rights over your life, that you should live or die, comes and lays down his life on a cross that you might live, that you might be forgiven? As we said, you might be here this morning and you might be a broken person in your heart. You might be broken by abortion. You might be haunted by the desire to commit suicide. You might know that you hate someone and you can't get rid of it. And you might know very well just how broken you are. But the Redeemer offers you forgiveness and life. He knows all about you. He knows you. You're not missed on his radar. You know, a few weeks ago, I was walking down to church. And I was walking along, and before I noticed it, there was a little curbstone, and I trod on it, and it was broken, and it shot all the water up my leg and over my trousers. And I thought, oh, dear me. And I carried on walking. And I looked at that little tiny broken bit, and I thought, wow, it made such a mess of my trousers. Well, I was walking down today. And I walked straight past that site, and I couldn't believe it, because there was new cement, and it was firmly fixed. And I thought, wow, who thought of that? Who took time out to fix that little bit of curb? Do you think you're missed? Do you think you're not known? Do you think you're going through something on your own? Do you think your sorrow is just for you? God knows you. He knows all about you. He knows what you've done, and he's willing to fix you. He's the only one that can fix you. He sent his precious son to be that sacrifice that releases you from the prison of that city, of guilt. What a wonderful God has made this world. What a wonderful God offers to redeem us all. Why? Because he knows the preciousness of human life. We've forgotten it, but he knows it. So to love your neighbor is not to murder. Not to murder in society, not to murder in the womb, not to murder in the church, not to murder with your hands, not to murder with your heart, not to murder with your words. May God help us to his glory.